Chapter 10. During middle childhood, kids are in Erikson's fourth stage of industry versus inferiority. Kids naturally build or deconstruct things. As long as they're encouraged to explore like this and don't have learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities that slow them down, this can lead to a sense of industry. If adults won't let kids do things on their own, or if the kid has developmental problems that prevent this, feelings of inferiority can develop. Self-image, self-concept, and self-esteem all play into the child's developing sense of self. Respectively, these terms refer to them developing an overall image of themselves, a concept of how they perform in specific areas, like I'm bad at math and good at volleyball, and feelings about their worth. Self-esteem is further broken down into two types, earned or global. By accomplishing things, kids earn esteem. Global self-esteem is typically given by others and may actually lead to inflated self-esteem based on empty praise. Since the 60s, we've blamed low self-esteem for lots of problems, but low self-esteem is correlated with a lot of problems. At this age, there are behavioral and conduct problems, and low self-esteem can contribute to higher levels of anxiety. Caring mothers and programs like Head Start appear to foster high self-esteem the most. Other factors include the parents themselves having high self-esteem and being accepting of their children, the parents setting clear and consistently enforced rules, and parents respecting their kids and allowing them to contribute their ideas and participate in family decisions. At this age, physical appearance and social acceptance are also extremely influential in sense of self and overall esteem. Girls and boys tend to switch places in their self-esteem, with girls starting out higher when younger, under 13, and then boys getting higher once they enter puberty. Hispanic boys report higher rates of low self-esteem, and African American girls report lower rates of low self-esteem, perhaps because they appear to be less impacted by their body weight than Caucasian girls. Across the races and genders, however, BMI is directly related to self-esteem. Too much TV watching has also been linked to low self-esteem. Involvement in sports seems to be protective, and for white boys can also lower their rates of risky and potentially deadly behaviors, such as taking dares or using drugs. Developing self-control becomes even more important when kids enter school. Now, kids not only should not throw tantrums, but should quietly sit at their seats. Some kids can't control themselves well due to genetic disorders like ADHD or intellectual impairments, or because of their parents' poor modeling of pro-social behaviors, or even of antisocial behaviors like aggression. The worst cases receive a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, which is usually diagnosed once they hit school, but can be as early as 2 or 3. Schools assign labels such as socially maladapted, behaviorally challenged, or emotionally disabled. Because kids with ADHD have more trouble controlling their impulses and behaviors, they often receive these labels. Kids with any diagnosed problem will have an IEP, Individualized Education Plan. Remember that accidents are the leading cause of death for kids on up to adolescence. Those who have trouble controlling their behavior and impulses are often more prone to risk-taking behaviors and thus to deadly accidents. Boys engage in more risk-taking than girls, and kids whose parents don't monitor them, set firm rules, and provide them with love and support are also more prone to risk-taking. At this age, kids learn that their inner states can be defined as emotions, and they understand that they can either choose to express those emotions or not express them. Emotional regulation begins to follow societal gender expectations, with boys learning to avoid the expression of most of their negative emotions, like sadness, although anger is more tolerated among boys than girls, and girls learning to avoid expressing anger and to be empathetic. Girls are also better at reading other people's emotions, understanding nonverbal cues, and intent, if something was an accident or not. While boys can be physically and directly aggressive, girls are usually passive-aggressive, using what's called relational aggression, and simply becoming pouty or sad when they're angry. Urban kids report higher levels of anger, and across all age groups, people living in urban areas report experiencing more stress. Fear is more specific than anxiety. Fear is tied to something that's imminent. Anxiety is longer lasting, wider in scope, and is just worry about uncertainties. Younger kids, especially girls, have more fears and more intense fears, but those fears and resulting anxieties typically decline with age and over time. That may just be because we become better at verbalizing our fears, and that allows us to develop coping skills. Kids can develop a specific phobia that can last longer, such as fear of spiders or even of attending school. But keep in mind that disorders have to greatly impact the person's life, interfering with normal behaviors, causing distress to self or others, all of those criteria, before they can be diagnosed. All kids experience fears, and this is natural. Preschoolers tend to be afraid of imaginary monsters, of the dark, or of being left alone. Elementary-age kids fear failure and criticism, illness, loss of family members, and supernatural things like ghosts. Across all age groups, all people fear death and injury. People of low SES report more fears and more intense fears, but there do not seem to be racial or ethnic differences. That may simply be because poor people typically live in higher crime areas that present more real-life dangers. Children suffer when their parents are imprisoned, they witness domestic violence, they experience the death of a family member, especially when it was unexpected, traumatic, or when the child witnessed it. They're homeless, move repeatedly, lose a home due to a natural disaster like in a fire or flood or after divorce, and when they have chronic health conditions. Exposure to all of these experiences, to school shootings, and to war, increases the risk of developing disorders like PTSD. PTSD has been on the rise among kids since 9/11. The media coverage of events like 9/11, school shootings, and disasters like Hurricane Katrina expose kids to scary events beyond their control. Children of parents who are serving overseas may be at particular risk. The longer their parent serves, the more their anxiety increases and persists. In addition to excessive anxiety, other possible PTSD symptoms in young kids include trouble sleeping, regressive behaviors like bedwetting or thumb-sucking, trouble concentrating and/or learning, an exaggerated startle response, detachment, feeling helpless, irritability, and aggressiveness. These kids need to be reassured that things will get better in the future. The more stability and security you can provide in at least one place, either home or a school setting, the better. Stress is something we all face and to some extent is adaptive. It helps us study for tests rather than blowing them off and forces us to develop coping mechanisms. But we all know how bad it can be if we're not able to cope well. It's especially a problem for kids who haven't yet developed good coping strategies. There are two main types of coping, problem-focused and emotion-focused. Problem-focused coping attacks the issue and changes the situation itself. If you don't like that bully, you'll stop playing near him at recess, or you might tell your teacher. Emotion-focused coping occurs when you tell yourself he's really not that bad after all. You change the way you feel about the situation. Often people using this style will simply avoid the problem and distract themselves. Older people will smoke as a coping strategy, but that doesn't attack the original problem. Overweight kids and those of stressed parents report higher levels of stress themselves. Across all age groups, people who feel like they have no control over their lives experience more stress. As we age, we're able to develop an internal locus of control, feeling like we ourselves can impact our situation, versus an external locus of control when it's all beyond our control and is just luck, fate, chance, or others controlling our lives. There are also individual differences in stress responses. Some kids simply react to stressors with a higher level of arousal. Depending on the family's composition, kids get their parents' attention for varying amounts of time. In homes with two biological parents where the mom stays home, kids have a parent's time for 22 hours a week. When both parents work, that falls to 19 hours a week, and single moms average 9 hours of time with their kids per week. But this doesn't mean that working outside the home is always bad. It's more about the quality of time spent. And when moms do work outside the home, their daughters can particularly benefit by becoming more independent, developing higher self-esteem, and performing better in school. Working moms probably have to deal with guilt over missing some time with their kids, but typically feel higher esteem themselves because they feel more valued and are contributing to the family's finances. Although moms still do more child rearing than dads, that has evened out over recent decades, and dads are crucial to their child's development. Simply having a dad living with the child is highly correlated to the child's self-esteem, well-being, and school performance. Biological dads who are either raising their children alone or who are remarried tend to spend the most time with their kids, especially their sons. Married biological dads also invest resources. Stepdads are not likely to spend money on stepkids. In one study, they were 5 times more likely to give money for college to their biological child than to a stepchild. The younger the kids are, the more time stepdads will spend with them, especially if the man has his own biological children. Stepkids typically develop warm feelings for stepparents, especially their stepdads. Cohabiting dads or father-like men typically spend the least amount of time with kids living in their home, and these kids suffer some ill effects in the form of low self-esteem, poor school performance, and behavioral problems. If the men contribute their time and resources, the outcomes are better, but these relationships are more likely to end, which causes new problems. Some divorced dads abandon their kids. In 2004, 40% of kids in father-absent homes reported not having seen their dad at all during the past year. If dads were close to their kids from birth, can cooperate well enough with their ex-wife, have consistent contact with their own father, and feel like they're good providers, they're more likely to maintain contact after a divorce. Often people are clueless as to what kids after a divorce are really worried about. They can feel torn between loyalties for their two parents, and they often blame themselves for not only the separation and divorce, but also for the parental conflict. According to Wallerstein and Kelly, children of divorce have 6 tasks: accept that it's happening, get back into their normal routines, deal with the loss of their old life, deal with their anger and self-blame, and forgive themselves and their parents, accept that the divorce is permanent, and believe in their relationships again with their parents and everybody else. The age of the child, how much the parents are in conflict, the gender of the child and custodial parent, moms and daughters, and fathers and sons are often happier. The visitation agreement and schedule, and the family's income all contribute to a child's ability to adjust. While not always due to divorce, children raised by single moms are more often raised in poverty and are more likely to become single parents themselves. The highest rate of single mother families is among African American women. In 2008, 72% of all Black women who had a child were single. Even though family sizes have been shrinking since the days of family farms, most families still have more than one child. More than 80% of U.S. kids have at least one sibling, and if it's a positive relationship, sibling bonds contribute significantly to the child's development. Most are highly charged, but if kids can learn to resolve disputes on their own without help from the adults, they learn how to compromise and negotiate, and their empathy is higher. They also learn that they're separate individuals from their siblings, but that they can count on each other. Although peer relationships are typically viewed as most important during the teen years, it all starts during middle childhood, particularly during what's called pre-adolescence, which is also as puberty starts. Kids truly figure out how to be close to friends, teaching them about loyalty, empathy, and trust, and leading to positive self-esteem, good performance and adjustment in school, and just good overall psychological health. Later in life, if men in their 30s didn't have friends while in middle childhood, they had higher rates of BMI and higher blood pressure. Friends allow kids to become somewhat independent from adults, pursuing their own interests, acquiring some status. In middle childhood, we start to see cliques and popular kids versus socially isolated different kids emerge, and learning about cultural expectations. Kids start segregating themselves into same-sex playgroups around grade 3, but it intensifies by grade 5. This separation seems to help girls learn how to foster very close friendships and develop their emotional intelligence, but for boys, many of them feel isolated due to the gender-expected suppression of their feelings. Popularity is usually determined by physical attractiveness, which varies among different cultures. In our U.S. culture, with a thin ideal, girls as young as 6 will diet, but for most, being thin doesn't solidify until around age 8. Because the thin ideal is linked to eating disorders, to be the most successful, interventions have to begin well before adolescence, during this middle childhood and pre-adolescent stage. Popular kids are usually easy to spot. They're outgoing, interested in others, friendly, active, confident, but not overly so, not braggarts, and pro-social. For boys, it can sometimes be a little different, when those who are tougher are recognized as the most popular. There can be both pro-social and antisocial popular boys. Unpopular kids are typically different in some way, and they appear uninterested in things, lazy, disconnected, shy, and withdrawn. They can also be children who are loud, demanding, attention-seeking, rebellious, and arrogant. Bullying and now cyberbullying have become epidemic problems in schools. Boys are more physical in their anger, and male bullying victims are often physically bullied, while girl victims are more often bullied by way of relational aggression, rumors, sexual innuendos, and social isolation. 4 out of 5 girls experience sexual harassment at school. In addition to being viewed as different, bullying victims are often younger, timid, weaker, unconfident, and bad at sports. Obviously, bullying is devastating for victims, even leading to suicide, but it also negatively impacts the bullies themselves, who often have trouble being accepted socially and even commit crimes. Intervention programs at schools that promote pro-social behaviors and empathy have shown some positive effects, especially for girls. Schools are usually the first big step into the greater world outside of family. We still can't agree on what schools should teach, values, just the core education, and what should that core curriculum be exactly? Should schools teach soft skills to prepare students for jobs? Schools have been changing too. The No Child Left Behind legislation led to teaching to the test and limited teachers' instructional freedom. There are now more types of schools to consider. Schools sort students, separating the gifted from those who should seek employment as soon as possible. Ideally, schools should be equalizers, allowing students coming from disadvantaged situations or with disabilities a chance to overcome and even thrive. More and more nowadays, schools are also serving as daycares. Many parents rely on after-school programs to monitor their kids and cut down on latchkey kids at home accidents and delinquent activities. After-school programs have helped kids finish their homework, learn pro-social skills, learn to better control their behavior, achieve higher grades, watch less TV, become more physically active, and have access to better nutritional options. Some schools are evolving into community centers that run year-round and are open daily to both students and parents, providing them with resources and training. How well a kid does in school depends on his or her sources of motivation, attributions of causality, locus of control, income level, race, ethnicity, gender, self-fulfilling prophecies, and the expectations of others. Very young kids are motivated by extrinsic motivation, which is when they receive external awards. Intrinsic motivation develops in middle childhood and on through adulthood, and it produces more lasting results in terms of achievement. That's when you're motivated by internal desires. You do well in school because that's gratifying to you personally, not because you get prizes in the form of good grades. Extrinsic rewarding can lessen a child's tendency to be curious and independent and to develop intrinsic motivation. Attributions of causality refer to what do you think explains your success? If you think that you're successful because of your ability, then you'll probably work hard in the future. That's having an internal locus of control. You yourself can control how well you do, and it leads to more success. But if you think that you had a success just because of dumb luck, fate, or because someone else gave it to you, that's having an external locus of control, and you'll be much less likely to work hard. Kids who live in conditions of poverty or at least low SES are less likely to believe that their hard work will earn them successes in life. That's more of a middle-class philosophy. At first, most kids believe that their effort will pay off, but by the 7th grade, Latino and Black students change from idolizing high achievers to now idolizing low-achieving students. They decide school isn't for them, and often it's not. Teachers, even unknowingly, aren't as supportive or encouraging of minority students, and more often view them as disrespectful or difficult. Donna Beagle is an expert on poverty and talks about the poverty mindset, referring to the tendency to think that hard work simply isn't enough. This is something that's very difficult for middle-class people who typically run the schools to understand. We say, you can do it if you just work hard, but that's overly simplistic. In our book, it mentioned that even teachers who started out in a lower class often still encourage their students to adopt middle-class values regarding working hard and respecting authority. It might be that their success as teachers was at least in part due to the fact that they were able to adopt these middle-class values. Different racial and ethnic groups have historically been abused or at least neglected by the educational system. Black slaves didn't receive any education. Native American kids were taken from their families, forced to speak English, and placed in white schools, which wasn't what their families wanted. Immigrant families today want their kids to be successful, but remain suspicious of the school system that wasn't set up for them and doesn't adequately serve their needs. We won't speak your language here, only English. Different groups also respond better to different motivators than those that work best for white students. For example, kids from collectivistic cultures are most motivated by receiving their family's praise. White kids just need to be praised individually, but all of those good jobs from teachers might not have much impact on a collectivistic kid who would benefit more from bragging to the family. There are also gender differences. Boys do well in math and science, girls in reading and writing, some of which is simply due to the fact that girls' fine motor skills develop earlier, so they're better at holding a pen and writing. Remember how we've talked about how boys are more often diagnosed with behavioral disorders and ADHD? Some of that is simply because boys have a harder time sitting still and need to release their energy in a more physical way. Boys have hormonal surges every single day, so not only is sitting still harder for them, but they also have more trouble than girls at sustaining their attention and following rules. Because girls tend to have higher levels of interpersonal skills and are more verbal, that gives them an advantage in school settings. Girls take more AP classes, attend college more, and graduate with over half of the bachelor's and master's degrees. Girls and boys are even in the race for doctoral and postdoctoral degrees, though. Boys actually score higher on tests like the SAT and ACT as well. Self-fulfilling prophecies are real. If you think you're dumb and will fail your test, chances are you will. Simply telling yourself that you'll do well is extremely helpful. Remember that as you study for your next test. In addition to what we think of ourselves, others' views of us also impacts us. In one study, students were randomly assigned to one of two groups, the smart kids and those who were slower. It was random. Teachers were then told which group each student belonged to, and then by the end of the year, was it the truly gifted students who scored the best? No, it was the randomly assigned group of students who were identified as being smarter. Their teachers believed in them, pushed them, and they did well as a result.